And then we're just going to do a quick review of the individual hormones that we spoke about, just talking about where they come from and what their function is in the body. So follicle stimulating hormone, a lot of these we have already touched upon in other lectures, so I didn't want to go too in detail. I just wanted to put a quick little blurb here for you to look back at if you just need like quick clarification on what something does if you forget. So follicle stimulating hormone is released by the anterior pituitary. It encourages the production of ova in females and the production of sperm in males. Luteinizing hormone is released also in the anterior. It's responsible for the release of the egg from the follicle in females and the production of testosterone in males. Remember, testosterone comes from the cells of Leydig that are in the testes in males, and that is promoted by luteinizing hormone. So adrenocorticotropin hormone, ACTH, is released by the pituitary, the anterior pituitary gland, and it acts on the adrenal cortex to stimulate cortisol secretion. So that is one of those tropic hormones that we just talked about. Thyroid stimulating hormone is also one of those tropic hormones, and it is released by the anterior pituitary, and it acts on the thyroid to secrete T3 and T4. Prolactin, which we spoke about, I think I spoke about that a little bit in my development lecture. It's also released by the anterior pituitary. It's not a tropic hormone because it actually directly affects the target tissue. So it promotes milk letdown from the mammary glands during breastfeeding. So it allows milk production. And there's like a surge of prolactin every time a mother goes to breastfeed. And as long as the mother is breastfeeding, the anterior pituitary will produce prolactin. It also releases endorphins. I think specifically it's beta endorphin. So the anterior pituitary releases these endorphins and they act on opioid receptors in the body. So they create a sense of calm and they reduce perception of pain. So those are sort of like the natural molecules that act on the natural opioid receptors in your body. And they're produced by the anterior pituitary. So growth hormone, sometimes it's abbreviated as GH, and it is released by the anterior pituitary as well into the bloodstream. And it just stimulates growth and a lot of pro-proliferative cell functions throughout the body. So it affects a lot of different tissues. Insulin and glucagon are produced by the islets of Langerhans, like we spoke about before, in the pancreas. So they decrease and increase blood glucose respectively. So insulin is going to decrease that blood glucose by letting the surrounding tissue uptake glucose, and glucagon is going to increase it by mobilizing those glucose stores. So glycogenesis, gluconeogenesis, it's going to get glucose into the blood. And T3 and T4 are both produced by the thyroid, and they circulate the body to increase basal metabolic rate. Calcitonin is also produced by the thyroid. It decreases the calcium level in the blood, like we spoke about a little bit before. And parathyroid hormone is secreted by the parathyroid gland, and it opposes calcitonin by increasing blood calcium levels. Okay, so not too in depth, but just a quick review of those hormones that I wanted. And we can talk a little bit about the digestive hormones. Like I said, we do have a digestive lecture that's going on next week, but the hormones in the digestive system do come up a lot because it is ruled. It does interact with the endocrine system pretty frequently in order to function properly. So I have these three and then another two, I believe, on the next slide. So cholecystokinin is usually abbreviated as CCK. These are the three most important ones that I usually see in terms of endocrine functioning of the digestive system. CCK is released by the duodenal epithelial cells when food enters the stomach. It stimulates the contraction of the gallbladder and inhibits gastric emptying. So it sort of constricts the pyloric sphincter is the structure that is right at the end of the stomach. It connects the stomach to the first part of the duodenum. That's called the pyloric sphincter. So the cholecystokinin actually inhibits gastric emptying by contracting that pyloric sphincter. And that's usually, it's released when food enters the stomach, and it's inhibited with acidic conditions entering the duodenum. So acidic conditions in the duodenum would mean that the bolus, which is the term for food after it's being digested and mixed in with digestive juices in the stomach, when that moves to the duodenum, it creates an acidic environment, and CCK is released, and it slows gastric emptying because the food is moving along properly. So we don't want too much food to enter the duodenum before it's properly digested. So CCK is released, and it inhibits gastric emptying. Gastrin is secreted by G cells in the cell wall of the stomach. It stimulates acid and pepsin secretion and gastric motility. So it actually increases gastric motility. So gastrin and CCK sort of work together to make sure that there's proper flow of gastric emptying into the duodenum. And gastrin is also stimulated when food enters the stomach. And then the third one is secretin. Secretin stimulates the flow of bile to the gallbladder and stimulates the release of bicarbonate from the pancreas. So CCK stimulates the contraction of the gallbladder to actually release the bile through the common bile duct into the duodenum. The secretin is actually what allows the bile to go from the liver to the gallbladder. And it stimulates the release of bicarbonate from the pancreas, and bicarbonate release is a response to the acidic bolus reaching the duodenum, kind of like CCK. So your stomach is pretty acidic, and it needs to be acidic in order to denature proteins and start chemical digestion the way it's supposed to be started. But once it enters the duodenum, it actually needs more of an alkaline environment, more of a neutral environment. And I'm getting a little bit out of the scope of this specific lecture, so we'll definitely talk more about this during the digestive lecture. But secretin is responsible for the bicarbonate release into the duodenum, and it is because of that acidic condition that reaches the duodenum. Okay, and two other digestive hormones that I see a lot on the MCAT are ghrelin and leptin. So ghrelin is the hunger hormone. It is released by the stomach that stimulates the appetite and promotes fat storage. So ghrelin levels peak before meals and during fasting. So that really is what stimulates your appetite. It drives us to eat. If you ever experience hunger pangs, sometimes it feels like your stomach is kind of squeezing up. That is pretty much directly a result of a spike in ghrelin levels before you're supposed to eat. So it really promotes the behavior of ingesting food. And ghrelin and leptin sort of work together.Ghrelin's the hunger hormone. Leptin is the satiety hormone. It makes you feel full. It promotes feelings of fullness and satiety. It is released by fat cells, and it is received by the hypothalamus. So that's also sort of a negative feedback mechanism. The more food you eat, the more fat cells are going to be present, and the more fat cells there are, the more leptin is supposed to be released. So that should, in theory, suppress your hunger until the fat cells, they're used up for energy. But we see leptin resistance. It's thought to be the main biological factor that contributes to obesity. So when you have high levels of leptin, you would expect to see someone who is very full and someone who doesn't want to eat. But when we look at the morbidly obese population, we actually see that leptin levels are extremely high compared to the average population. So one of the theories is that these individuals are leptin resistant. So they have a lot of leptin, but for whatever reason, the receptors on the target tissue, they are not as effectively accepting leptin as like the average population. So that contributes to obesity because there's no feeling of satiety or fullness. So the person will just eat. And that's why bariatric surgery comes into play. That's why it's so effective when compared to dieting, because long-term, when you're on a diet, your ghrelin levels will spike, and they'll maintain a very high level, even, for months after you start dieting. So it's very hard for a person to change their body's set point. They're like our homeostatic compensatory mechanisms that include ghrelin and leptin that keep, morbidly obese people morbidly obese. So it's a lot more than just psychological. It's psychological, biological, a bunch of different things. So that's why bariatric surgery also, it alters the anatomy of the human, but it also alters the physiology of endocrine functioning. So there are a couple of different procedures. I actually work at a bariatric surgery practice, so if anybody's interested, I'm definitely open to answering some questions. But a lot of the main surgeries reduce the size of your stomach. So it restricts the amount of food that comes into your stomach. And as we spoke about, your stomach is also a secretory organ. So it releases ghrelin. So when we remove part of the stomach, we're actually removing the parts of your body that are secreting this hunger hormone. So it helps in that aspect as well. And I have seen a couple of things on the MCAT regarding bariatric surgery and ghrelin and leptin levels and treatments for the morbidly obese population. So these are definitely some important things to know. Interesting. Okay, so a third of you said A, a third of you said C, and a third of you said D. So the correct answer is A, blood. If you didn't specifically know like what gastrin is or how it's released, a good jumping point is that it is a hormone. It's an endocrine hormone. And by definition, endocrine hormones are released into the blood and they circulate throughout the body. So the extracellular matrix, would probably be, no, that probably wouldn't even be the second best answer. It just wouldn't be released into the extracellular matrix unless like they would specifically say like some protein is being used for like juxtacrine signaling or paracrine signaling, maybe. But in terms of like regular hormones like gastrin, I don't think that that would be a feasible response. Digestive duct. I don't know if there's like a specific structure called the digestive duct. I just put digestive generally. If any sort of like hormone molecule is being released into a duct, it's considered exocrine, sort of like those enzymes that we'll talk about during the digestive system lecture. They're not really considered true hormones. Gastrin is a true hormone, so it's not released into a duct. And likewise, it's also not released into the lumen of the intestines. It's produced by the stomach, and it actually it is released directly into the bloodstream. So all three of these, they're secreted by structures that are part of the digestive system. So CCK and secretin, I believe, CCK is released by the duodenum, but it's not released into the lumen of the actual duodenum. It's released into the blood, and that's how it travels and affects the target cells. Same thing with gastrin. It is released by the stomach, and it is released into the blood. And same thing with secretin. It is released, I believe, I think it's also released by the duodenum, but it goes into the blood, and then it affects target cells by traveling through the circulatory system.